Once upon a time, you dressed so fine, you threw the bums a dime in your prime, didn't you? People'd call, say, beware, doll, you're bound to fall. You thought they were all kidding you. You used to laugh about everybody that was hanging out. Now you don't talk so loud. Now you don't seem so proud about having to be scrounging for your next meal. How does it feel? How does it feel to be without a home, like a complete unknown, like a rolling stone? Those are the words of Bob Dylan in what may be regarded as his finest song. I don't know. You be the judge. I think it's subjective, but it's definitely up there with his the best songs he ever wrote. And this song has a story behind it, because this was part of his breakaway from folk music into rock and roll in his bid to become a rock star. Or did he? Was he really trying to become a rock star? I mean, we know that he admired Elvis, Buddy Holly, Little Richard since he was a teenager. And I think maybe he always felt that he didn't quite have the voice or the persona to be like a rock star, but it was always kind of an ambition of his, even if it didn't quite work out for him. Instead, he turned into perhaps the greatest songwriter of the late 20th century. Hey, he won the Nobel Prize, so I guess important people agree with that. Hard to dispute. I mean, it's hard to think of anybody who, when it comes to pure songwriting, can match or exceed Bob Dylan's output. I mean, look at this book. This is his complete collection, 600 pages, hundreds of songs, all good songs. I mean, I've said before, there's really no stinker in the lot as far as I'm concerned. So, great songwriter, not a rock star. Anyway, I want to talk about the movie A Complete Unknown today, because I just saw it last night for the first time, because it just came out on rental, or you can buy it on Amazon or Apple TV or whatever. Anyway, I didn't have access to it before then because I'm in China, and it has not been screened in China. So most of you who are Dylan fans, if you live in the United States, you probably saw it over the Christmas holiday. But I've been stuck in China all winter as usual, so didn't get to see it. But a lot of my friends saw it, and my dad saw it. My dad was a Bob Dylan fan when he was in his 20s, and he also played guitar. And like Bob Dylan, he's also Jewish, so interesting connection there. And my dad is almost the age of Bob Dylan. He was born in 43, so they were, same generation, my dad and mom. So I kind of grew up with Dylan, at least knowing about Bob Dylan, hearing him, hearing my dad play his records and talk about him now and then. I was never a big fan of Bob Dylan growing up. And as I've written on my blogs, it wasn't until my 20s that I kind of discovered Bob Dylan and kind of really learned to appreciate him as an artist. But I'm not here to talk about my engagement with Bob Dylan. I really want to stick to the subject. This, again, is kind of off the cuff. It's some immediate reflections on the movie that I saw last night with my wife. We watched it at home. on a projector screen on the wall. We have a nice projector that screens movies or TV shows on the wall and provides a kind of cinematic experience. And that was nice for this movie. I think it's a very cinematic movie. I wish I had seen it in the cinemas, but unfortunately, it wasn't one of the movies that's seems to be selected to be shown in China. I don't know if it's too political. Yeah, obviously. I just answered my own question. It's not really a political movie per se, although it does touch upon the politics of the age. Um, but I want to kind of break down the movie and talk about what I liked about it, what I thought was really good about the movie. You know, I'm a historian, so I like movies about history. I like movies that kind of put themselves in a historical context and maybe tell a story within the broader context of the history that people are going through. And this movie certainly does that quite well. I think it's one of the strong points of the movie is that you're constantly aware that there's a larger historical context in which Bob Dylan is emerging. So it helps to explain his emergence as an artist in that time period. And it tells the personal story of Bob Dylan arriving in New York City, kind of settling into the village where he starts to make a name for himself and starts to get noticed first as a folk musician. Um, and I guess the arc of the story is his journey from being kind of a straight up folk musician with a almost an obsession for Woody Guthrie and that style of music, to the point where he kind of breaks away from the folk tradition and launches himself as a would-be rock star. And here's where I felt the movie had some problems, but I'll get to that. So what's good about the film? First of all, I think the actors were quite good. I mean, especially Ed Norton as Pete Seeger. I think Ed really shined in that role. He really embodied that role. He sounded like Pete Seeger. He acted like Pete Seeger. He really provided a kind of balance throughout the movie, a character that doesn't change, but that stands for something very powerful. And he's kind of a conduit for Bob Dylan, the main character, to sort of facilitates his rise as a star, introduces him to the right people in the right places, gets him into the scene. And that's all, I think, fairly true to the real Bob Dylan story. I'm not an expert on Bob Dylan. I'm not pretending to be an expert on Bob Dylan and his story. I have read some of the Bob Dylan literature, and I have a whole bunch of Bob Dylan books on my shelf that I'm hoping to read soon as I continue to dig into his life story. But I think, from what I do know about the story of his early days and his rise, it was a much richer story than what is being portrayed in the film. And I think probably a lot of Bob Dylan sort of historians and fans have commented on this already. So it's not news to anybody who really knows the Bob Dylan story. They simplified it. Of course, this is Hollywood. This is filmmaking. This is a biopic. You have to kind of simplify it and create kind of a legend out of it. So they simplified the story, they streamlined it, they made Pete Seeger kind of his main contact in that world. And I think that's a little misleading because, when I think of those days, the first name that comes to my mind is Dave Van Ronk. Dave Van Ronk, a phenomenal guitar player, singer, performer, who was just deep in that scene, in the village scene. And I think Van Ronk was very instrumental kind of serving as a mentor to Bob. And so I think for Bob Dylan fans, it's a bit disappointing that Dave Van Ronk didn't really get the attention that he should deserve in a film portrayal like this. So I think the richness and density of the characters who inhabited that world, who served as conduits for Bob Dylan to emerge as an artist, that's kind of lost in this movie. And if you like the movie and you're a fan of Bob Dylan, I urge you to read more about those early days. Read some of the biographies and the accounts of Bob Dylan's rise as an artist, because it's a much richer story than what's being portrayed in the film. But again, I mean, this is inevitable. A film has to make judgments about which characters to focus on, and I think, for the purposes of the film and the story, I think Pete Seeger was the right character because he kind of carries the film forward. He's there at the Newport Festival, which is the climax of the film. He kind of represents that cadre of folk artists who want to kind of keep a purity to the music. So it probably made sense, but it's still a little disappointing that there wasn't more of Dave Van Ronk and others in that story of the early days. I think that the film did a decent job of portraying the village in those days. It's a good thing that the village hasn't been completely and utterly like demolished and destroyed, and it's still kind of intact. That a lot of the buildings and places that were around in the 60s are still there in the village today. It's relatively well preserved, so they could kind of, use that as backdrop. I like the way that they portrayed the clubs, like the Gaslight, these coffee houses and clubs where Bob Dylan first emerged as an artist. I think that was a good feature of the movie as well, just kind of digging into that village scene. That was pretty cool. You really get a sense of the vibes, the different music in different clubs, and what the music meant to people, meant to the audience, and how they interacted with the performers. So, as a historian who studies live music scenes and who's written a lot about live music scenes and club scenes, I thought that was a pretty authentic portrayal of club scenes. Maybe a little bit stilted, like I don't know. The audience is always a little. I feel the audience is always a little too passive in these scenes. That there ought to be a little bit more variety in the behavior of the audience, and not this kind of adulation that you see. And I, another thing just to push back on. Although I liked the setting and everything, and the way the scenes were portrayed in general, like nobody's talking when these guys are performing. I mean, come on, that's not a typical club or bar scene, where everybody's sitting down having drinks and nobody's talking. Everybody's paying rapt attention to the person on stage. Absolutely not. No musician who's played in those kind of scenes would have that experience. People are talking, people are hanging out, some people are paying attention, some people are caught up in their own little dramas at their tables. So that was a little bit, that felt a little false. That aspect of it felt false. But the setting, I guess the style, the clothing and all that stuff, that felt somewhat more genuine. So yeah, I guess when it comes down to it, I have a bit mixed feelings about the staging, the settings in which Bob Dylan is starting to perform, along with Joan Baez, of course, who is kind of his counterweight, you could say, in the movie. And, I don't want to get too much into the problems of the film. I want to continue to say some of the positive things about it. So let's focus on the main. Let's just say the three main actors. I guess there was Timothy Chalamet plays Bob Dylan. There's the character who plays Joan Baez. I'll have to insert her name because I don't remember her name offhand. And there's the character who plays the Suze Rotolo character, whose name is Sylvie in the movie. And I think the movie kind of revolves around, I don't want to call it a love triangle because it's not that simple, but around the relationship between Bob and these two women seems to be one of the main drivers of the story, if you could call it that. Um, at one point, I think my wife said, "Where is the story?" That was another issue with the film, is sometimes it's hard to follow the story, especially if you're not a big fan of Bob Dylan and don't know a lot about this time period in his career. Um, but you've got these three characters. I think the women were just, wow, spot on, amazing. The performers who played uh, Joan Baez and the Suze Rotolo character were really fantastic, fantastic performers. And Timothy Chalamet, I want to, before I get into some of the issues that I found with his performance, I want to say some good things. I mean, first and foremost, the fact that he really studied the guitar for 5 years or so, they say, that he learned to play guitar. It's kind of hard to believe, but then again, I mean, I didn't start learning to play guitar until I was in my 20s. It's certainly possible to become a good guitar player with 5 years of hard work when you're in your 20s. I think it would be much harder in your 40s or 50s. Almost impossible, I would say. But in the 20s, you're still a bit malleable. You can pick up the motor skills. So I think that the fact that he really um, devoted himself to learning guitar, I find it hard to believe that all the guitar playing that, um, of Bob Dylan in the movie is Timothy Chalamet. I mean, a lot of it just sounded much more professional than I think he could have ever achieved in that time. Um, but I don't know the details of how those songs were recorded. Obviously, he was performing some of the music, and obviously he's singing. And I think that he did kind of capture some aspects of the Bob Dylan voice and the Bob Dylan delivery, which is not easy. As I've said in previous videos I've made, Bob Dylan was like an acrobat, a vocal acrobat. I mean, to deliver the complexity of his lyrics in those song structures is not an easy task. So I think when it came to the singing and the performing and the guitar playing, Timothy Chalamet really stood up to the plate and gave it his best. But on the other hand, and I'll get to this later, I feel he falls short as a performer of capturing something about some kind of essence of Bob Dylan. And again, I'll get to that. And in all fairness, I'm not sure any actor could have achieved that, but maybe somebody could have done a somewhat better job. I mean, I can see why they picked Timothy Chalamet. He's got sort of that lithe body, the hair, just he's not the spitting image of Bob, but he certainly sort of maybe embodies some aspect of Bob Dylan looks at a younger age. So yeah, you got to give it to him for learning his chops, for picking up the guitar. It'd be great to see what he does with that in the future, whether he continues to play music and perform, whether that's become kind of part of his heart and soul. But anyway, kudos to him for that aspect of the role. Let's get to some of the issues that I had and that others may have with the film. Again, it's not quite fair to compare a even a 2.5 hour film to like a biography or an account that gives you a much richer, nuanced perspective. Films have to condense, they have to kind of mythologize to some degree. And I think that this film does all that. But I think one thing that's kind of, let me just go through, some of the things that I thought were kind of missing from the film. I think when it comes to the persona of Bob Dylan, which you can see in the documentaries, in the biographies and other portrayals of Bob Dylan at that time, I felt like Timothy Chalamet's role didn't quite capture the genius of Bob Dylan. And again, hey, who can capture a genius? I mean, that's like putting a genie back in the bottle, you know. Um, there's something about Bob Dylan and the way his mind works, the his poetic mind and his linguistic capabilities that is just beyond a normal human being, obviously. And I don't think that Timothy Chalamet's performance really captured that. I don't know if it was the scripting or the way he embraced the role or limitations in his own ability to portray this, but there's a kind of like genius to Bob Dylan in the way he converses, the way he interacts with people. And again, my wife commented on this. There's a kind of charm that Bob Dylan has that wasn't really captured in this portrayal. And I don't know, I feel like Timothy Chalamet was sort of channeling Bob Dylan from the perspective of his generation, more kind of an angsty emo Bob, rather than the I don't know, the trickster, the joker, the clever genius. There was just something missing, a certain sense of humor, a certain witty repartee that I feel like Bob had even in those days where he was able to charm the socks off of the people he met, which you just don't see in this film. And it leaves you wondering, why is everybody adulating this guy, right? So I felt that part kind of fell short. Instead, what we get is a more angsty Bob, a more sort of, he starts out as kind of an ingenue who's really dedicated to the Woody Guthrie approach and a big fan and goes to the hospital to visit him and all that. But then later he emerges as this kind of angsty, rebellious sort of James Dean wannabe with his leather jacket and his motorcycle. And I just didn't buy it. There was something in that portrayal that just didn't strike me as, as Bob. It was just a little too serious. The levity, I feel like, of Bob Dylan was kind of lacking in that performance, and instead it was sort of this heavy, angsty, chain smoking, kind of motorcycle riding, leather jacket, sneering kind of personality, which I'm sure was part of Bob's image at times, but I don't think it comes close to really capturing the magic persona of Bob Dylan. So that was kind of missing from the movie, I felt. And also it felt as if the songs were just sort of springing out of his brain, and you didn't really get a sense of the process. I'm always interested, as a musician myself and as somebody who's with a lifelong passion for music, I'm always interested in what's the process? How do they come up? What's the songwriting technique? How do they come up with these incredible songs? And you didn't really get that. It was just song after song. They're hitting you with all his big songs from that era and song after song. And you don't really, there's a couple of scenes where he's writing at night and coming up with words, but you don't really get an insight into Where is that coming from? What are the sources? What are the well springs? What are the muses that are giving him, that are speaking to him and giving him these incredible lyrics? So again, maybe this is unfair. Maybe this is not to be expected in a Hollywood biopic, but that aspect of Bob's talent and genius was kind of missing from the film. It was kind of like everything was like Athena springing out of Zeus's head, fully formed. All these songs just coming out. These one amazing song after another. Oh, I'm in the middle of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Okay, I'm gonna write songs about war, or a hard rain's gonna fall. But it sort of it didn't really it wasn't that convincing. So I think the connection with the history and the songwriting was a little too heavy-handed. Like, do we have to see all those television sets of Kennedy announcing the Cuban Missile Crisis, and then, hard rain's going to fall. Masters of War. Okay, there we go. That explains it all. Well, everybody was experiencing that. Why didn't anybody else write songs like that? Right? So I feel like that element was really missing in the film, and it kind of leaves you with a question mark about Bob Dylan's genius. And again, that's not to that has nothing to do with Timothée Chalamet's performance. So the flaws in Chalamet's performance that I just spoke about, they may have to do with his choices, or they may have to do with the script he was given and the directions he was given. I don't really know. But obviously, that aspect of the film is more about the writing of the film and the directing of the film itself. So I think if you're an ardent Bob Dylan fan, you're going to come out with a feeling a little bit, I don't know, dissatisfied with that aspect of the movie. And then there's the whole sort of arc about him trying to be a rock star. I mean, maybe it's unfair to say he's trying to be a rock star, but he's embracing rock and roll. One thing I did like, the actor who plays Bobby Newirth, I liked him. I thought he was an interesting element to add to the film, and their friendship and kind of camaraderie, and how he's sort of pulling him in a different direction. That was interesting. And I really like that actor, who I think is also a good musician as well. So the scene in the Irish bar, I think McCann's, that was a great scene where Bob is like, oh, yeah, I mean, this is Irish folk music, but this is rock and roll too. That was a cool scene. I thought that was a really brilliant scene to add to the story. The part about Al Cooper was, again, a little bit heavy-handed. It's like, you can't play keyboard. Hey, stay away from that keyboard. Oh, yeah? And then, of course, he plays the famous opening riff to Like a Rolling Stone. It was a little too heavy-handed. But I guess they had to kind of add that. It's nice that they mentioned Al Cooper and his role in the song, and Paul Butterfield, and how Bob was trying to get these great blues musicians together to create something new, something different, something electric. I mean, that was a cool aspect of it. Obviously, the Newport Festival, going on stage and performing, that's all history, right? I mean, that's all well documented. Maybe, there are things that the audience said in the film that weren't really said at the Newport Festival. We don't really know. Who knows? The whole Judas thing, who cares about that, really? I thought that was it's a pretty good scene. Pete Seeger running around trying to figure out what to do, and his wife saying, "No, no, no." That part was fun. That part was fun. And in the end, kind of Pete redeems himself. He accepts Bob, and Bob kind of redeems himself to the audience too, and all that I think was true to life, and it was a good ending to the film. The part with the Suze Rotolo character, again, I don't know. I don't know how true that was, but it seemed a bit Hollywoodish, right? Adding that dimension to the story. Joan Baez kicked ass, I think, the whole way through. Her character, the songs. I mean, you can see what a force she was in the folk world and in Bob Dylan's life in those early days. No story of Bob Dylan would be complete without talking about Joan Baez and her influence on him and vice versa. So that was a good aspect of the film. The duets that they do together, I think, were wonderful, wonderfully filmed and performed. So all in all, I mean, this is definitely a film to see if you're a Bob Dylan fan. You just have to kind of take it with a grain of salt, take it as a biopic. It's not going to get everything right. It's going to exaggerate and distort certain aspects. It's creating kind of a legend. But I'd say the biggest flaw was in the way Timothée Chalamet, whether it's his decision or not, but just kind of the way he performed Bob, I just felt was off the mark. I didn't think that he captured enough of Bob's spirit throughout especially in the latter part of the film. Maybe a little bit more in the early part where he plays the ingenue, but in the latter part where he just becomes kind of a prick of misery, as they would say. I just thought that part was a little overplayed. And we kind of miss seeing the other side, the more charming side of Bob as a result. If I were Bob Dylan, I probably wouldn't want to watch this film. I don't think I would want to see somebody portray me as a young man. I don't know. I'm not sure. Who knows? But I understand that Bob didn't really have much to do with the making of the film. I think maybe he kind of gave it his, the green light, but I don't think that I think he was very hands off. But I don't know. I don't know that for sure. I'm sure there are fans who know a lot more about that than I do. Anyway, I've gone on long enough, and those are my main thoughts about the film, and I hope you do see it and enjoy it, and I hope that it does what it's supposed to do, which is to introduce a whole new generation to the music of Bob Dylan. If the film can achieve that, then it will have definitely been worth the making of this movie. So that's enough on A Complete Unknown for now. Over and out. Don't forget to comment on what you heard today. If you think I'm full of doggy doo-doo, let me know. But if you agree with my ideas or want to provide your own opinions, that's fine too. Cheers.